actually make a difference. I think paying attention to those countries, India, China, the Pacific Rim countries, makes perfect sense. I don't think I would give up on the others. As you said, we've got huge economic relations with the European Union. You hope it won't fall off a cliff. I think it will go down. I think we've got to keep working at that. And I don't think we should give up on our relationship with the United States, though we need to recognize that America itself is entirely transactional. But there's many issues which the Biden administration care about, which happen to coincide with British values and interests, and I think we should carry on seeking to engage closely with them too.
You're one of the most experienced diplomats in the UK. How do you balance out principle and pragmatism in a relationship with China right now? You, again, going back to your past, you spent many years working as a diplomat under the Blair government. Now, Tony Blair was famous for talking about a foreign policy driven by values. He talked about humanitarian interventionism. We hear that the United States government believes the Chinese are conducting a policy of quote-unquote genocide against the Muslim minority Uyghur community in Xinjiang province. When you deal with China, how do you balance out principle and pragmatism?
It's a very difficult issue. I think that with China, as with a number of other countries, including, for example, Saudi Arabia, there is a real need to take a stand on the values that we hold dear. The United Kingdom has been pretty firm on human rights issues in China and on the way in which Hong Kongers have been treated, and it's done the right thing by making it easier for them to come to the United Kingdom. And we've also stood up for freedom of navigation and issues like that, which China feels strongly about and where we are not on the same page in the South China Sea. Now, how do you reconcile pragmatism and principle? I think you have to be true to yourselves, and you have to also pursue the things that you think
Cloud connected.
Those governments. Now, in the case of China, it might be climate change, and it might be trade, and it might be supply chains, and it might be innovation, it might be global trade. There's a lot of issues. If you look at John Kerry, for example, the US climate czar, he will say we've taken a very firm line with China on values and human rights, but we're also discussing in a very productive way the importance of making progress on climate change. I don't see why the United Kingdom can't and shouldn't do the same thing. You can do both. The one does not exclude the other.
Really? And you don't think that that smacks of cynicism, that you mouth the rhetoric of standing up for human rights while in fact acknowledging a very, very pragmatic principle that China is so economically important now that frankly you turn a blind eye to many of the abuses that they are alleged to be undertaking?
No, I don't think you should turn a blind eye at all. As I was saying, I think you should stand up for the values and the principles that you hold dear, but you should also recognize that if you want, for example, to stop the destruction of this planet, you've got to talk to China as well as to other people about that. It's not about turning a blind eye. It's about trying to deal with all those different elements of a complex relationship, the one not excluding the other. I think, for example, in the case of Saudi Arabia, it is right that America and the United Kingdom should refuse to supply weapons that are being used indiscriminately in the civil war in Yemen. And I believe we have done that. So I think you've got to do what is right, but you've also, at the same time, you pursue the national interest as well. I don't think that's cynical and double standards.
There's a couple of other really important arenas around the world I want to talk to you about. We don't have much time, so let's quickly get on to the United States. And you, in your career, left Washington as British ambassador when the Obama administration came to an end. So you watched Trump from the outside. But the point about Donald Trump is that he changed so very much about the definition of US interest. He put America first. He adopted a clearly nationalist and indeed protectionist policy around the world. Some would say isolationist too. And the assumption that Joe Biden's going to reverse all of that seems in some ways to be a little misguided, not least because of what we've seen of his decision-making in Afghanistan, where he is going to stick to the Trump idea that troops have to be pulled out. He's extended the deadline till September, but nonetheless, they're coming home. So would it be fair to say that actually there are things about the Trump presidency and what he did that Joe Biden will actually continue rather than reverse?
I think you're right. There are some things that will not change. We haven't yet seen, for example, the elimination of all the extra tariffs which Trump put on some of America's trading partners. On Iran, even though the Biden administration thought it was completely wrong of Trump to tear up the nuclear deal, the current administration is saying, well, we're happy to go back to talks, but it needs to be the nuclear deal plus additional obligations on Iran. There are a number of issues, I think, on which, if you like, Biden will have to build on some of where Trump was. On the other hand, whereas Donald Trump was against NATO, against the European Union, against the WTO, against the WHO, against the United Nations, I think we have an administration which is much more multilateralist and ready to work with those institutions.
Cloud disconnected.
That's important. That's a really interesting point you're making, Sir Peter, but isn't the truth that many in Europe, despite hearing Joe Biden's rhetorical commitment to NATO, for example, they're not sure they can buy into it? I mean, Emmanuel Macron not so long ago said he believed that NATO was effectively brain dead. He said it was no longer pertinent. And we've heard many other European officials in the last few months saying just because Biden's now in power doesn't mean that we in Europe can assume that we can rely on America as a trusted and constant partner in the future in the way that we did in the past. We have to learn the lessons of Trump. Given all of that, isn't Vladimir Putin right now looking at NATO, looking at the lack of cohesiveness and, frankly, credibility in NATO and thinking to himself, I can pretty much do what I want?
He's certainly been thinking like that for the last 4 years because, on the whole, he got a free pass from President Trump. I think he'll be looking at NATO with slightly different approach now, but he's testing us. Look at all that build-up of troops on the Ukraine border. What is NATO? Of course, NATO is not treaty bound to defend Ukraine, but what is NATO going to do about European security? But the other point that you're sort of hinting at, which I think is a very important one, is that this is an American president who is on record as opposing most
Wi-Fi hotspot unavailable.
Libya and on the surge in Afghanistan and a number of other places. His view was that America should not be getting involved in faraway wars where it's not in a position to build nations or make things better. So you are dealing with a president who instinctively, and as we've seen in the decision that he has taken on Afghanistan, wants to bring the troops home, but is also committed to the alliances of which America is a member, and he has repeated his commitment to Article 5 of NATO, which is, an attack on one is an attack on all. So I would rather hope that Russia and other people are looking at the alliance and saying, well, it is still very much intact, while recognizing that America is in a rather different position than it was.
But there is so much, even as we talk, it strikes me there's so much more scope for misunderstanding and for unpredictable behaviors in the next few years than there were perhaps in the period in which you were serving as a British ambassador. Do you feel that too? Do you feel there is a much greater sense of risk right now?
I think there was great unpredictability over the last 4 or 5 years when even American officials had to understand what policy was by looking at Twitter at 5 o'clock in the morning, because it often didn't reflect the advice that the administration were giving to their own boss. And I think a lot of countries, China and Russia amongst them, but plenty of others, including ourselves, wondered what was happening from one day to the next. There was a level of unpredictability there. I think that some of that is now going, but we are in a global situation where an awful lot of things have changed, where a number of critical relationships are under review, and Biden has made that clear. I would hope that we can engage with China in a collective way which finds benefits for China as well as for others in the region, the Indo-Pacific point you are making, and for the rest of us, rather than leaves everybody wondering what's going on, and you end up with a kind of 1914 conflict by accident because of changing capabilities. I think we are moving away from the unpredictability we've had in the last few years towards something which I hope is a bit more predictable, and you've seen a very firm position from the Americans and others against Russia, for example, with substantial sanctions applied in response to the latest bits of cyber warfare. I think Russia is getting a clear message.
I want to end by switching focus and rather dramatically shifting subject matter, but it is in a sense linked. We've talked a lot about the future of Britain's role in the world. You, in the early 1990s, spent a couple of years working very closely with Prince Charles in his office. You know him very well, and many of our viewers around the world will, of course, have watched the funeral of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, in recent days. All of us are mindful that the Queen is of a very great age and that before too very long we expect to see a King Charles. And I would like to ask you whether you feel it is going to be a very different kind of monarchy when that transition comes about.
I think what we will see in the coming months and years a kind of seamless process whereby Prince of Wales becomes the dominant male member of the royal family, stepping into the shoes quietly of his late father. I think that is excellent preparation for everyone getting used to the idea of him becoming the monarch when that time happens. Will it be a very different sort of monarchy? Well, Prince of Wales is his own man. He, along with other members of the family, have been aware, as aware of any of us, for years, that if the monarchy does not keep itself relevant and modernize, it is going to lose its way and people are going to question what it is for. So already there's been streamlining, there has been cutting back, if you like, of the numbers of royals who are undertaking duties, although, funnily enough, because of changes within the family, we're seeing one or two of the younger members now assuming new roles, and we saw that at the time of Prince Philip's funeral. So I think you're going to see a change of personality for sure, but I took away from that funeral a sign of the monarchy, even in these extraordinarily difficult COVID times, being an institution which helps the people of Britain and perhaps more widely the Commonwealth and further afield realise that our monarchy is capable of getting us to lift our eyes temporarily from the awfulness of COVID and from the daily grind of politics and individual scandals and other things that are going on in the newspapers each day.
Sir Peter Westmacott, we have to end there. I thank you very much indeed for joining me on Hard Talk.
Thank you.
This is the BBC World Service, where gambling, a sure bet, continues.
I'm Dr. Heather Wardle, and I specialise in researching gambling.